I thought the call was a prank. It was 0214 when the dispatcher's voice came through my phone, steady and oddly impersonal. Dr. Hartley, surgical on call. We've got a critical transport en route, ETA 20 minutes. I sat up, throat raw from sleep, eyes on the ceiling fan turning slow. The word that pushed past my fog and lodged in my chest wasn't critical or surgical. It was the word the dispatcher wouldn't and couldn't use on the line. Someone had improvised the name on the manifest. No official records, no clear provenance, just a set of coordinates that I was told not to ask about, and a note in uppercase, large, non-human trauma. That phrasing alone should have set my rational brain on high alert. It didn't. What pulled me out of bed was not the thought of the specimen. It was the knowledge that once you put a living thing under anesthesia and on a table, the lines you can't redraw become visible. You make decisions, whether you mean to or not. You choose classification with your hands before any paper goes to a review board. I called Sarah on the way. She answered before I finished the first sentence. "Victor, don't speculate, just get here." She is all angles and decisions, the kind of director who wants problems in the morning with their edges already sharpened. Marcus was there ahead of me, as usual, already in scrubs, a cup of coffee cooling at the side of his workstation, eyes hollowed by the sort of nights veterinarians acquire when life hands them things that don't fit in job descriptions. Jennifer and Kyle hovered at the periphery, tense and efficient. It felt like the world had been split in two. The fluorescent, humming hospital, and the dark outside, where whatever had happened waited like a story without context. I had expected something monstrous. I had not expected the gentle dignity that stopped me the instant I saw him. They had brought him onto the table with a sheet half-draped. Big hands, the fingers thick as small branches, lay exposed. Hair, coarse but not matted, framed a face that, in any other light, would have been called human. The eyes were closed and mottled with light, but when he exhaled, there was an effortless, almost ritualistic rhythm to the chest. He was intact where it mattered, bone structures proportionally familiar, the teeth mostly unremarkable, their enamel worn in patterns that suggested age and diet rather than pathology. There were lacerations, a pelvic fracture, a collapsed lung. He was injured in ways any trauma surgeon would recognize. He was foreign in ways that telescoped the ordinary into reverence. We moved like a unit. No theatrics, no gawking. Marcus intubated with practiced hands. Jennifer took the lead on peripheral IVs, with an efficiency that belied her trembling. Sarah coordinated, voice low, decisive. Keep a tight chain of custody. Photographs only with protocol. Nobody texts, nobody posts. This is an emergency medical situation. Treat first, classify later. We stabilized him.
That is a sentence loaded with professional hubris. Stabilization is what we say when we accept temporary victory. We had to buy time. Time to know. Time to decide. Time to weigh the unmeasurable consequences of exposure. My first entry in the field journal that night is tersely factual. 0248, intubated, ET tube 8.0, pulse 78, spontaneous breathing present but shallow, multiple lacerations cleaned and packed, femur fracture splinted. I wrote in the margin, in handwriting that later my colleagues would tease me about for its slant toward melodrama, eyes too human. The immediate medical issues were straightforward trauma care. The interesting things emerged at the edges. Calluses on the knuckles that suggested tool use, not fighting. A healed crest on the scalp that might have been ceremonial, or simply an old wound. Smear patterns under the fingernails that looked disturbingly like ochre pigment. None of it was a smoking gun. That's the scientist's curse. You see patterns and simultaneously doubt them because your brain has been trained to expect coincidence. We did what we always do. Collect samples with meticulous bureaucratic reverence. Blood drawn into EDTA tubes labeled with codes. Hair plucked for mitochondrial analysis. A small biopsy of skeletal muscle under sterile conditions, flash frozen and logged. Marcus completed chain of custody forms before he would let a single vial out of his sight. We photographed wounds with calibrated scales, described muscle tone, noted reflexes. The thing I remember most clearly from that stretch was how carefully Jennifer touched his hand when she adjusted the sheet. It was a human gesture, soft, unobtrusive, and you could see in her movements a bridge being built. There is a particular clean anxiety to early morning sequencing. The lab is dark, and all the instruments look like sleeping animals until you flick them awake. Lisa arrived with the quiet confidence of someone who had made the decision to be fascinated by genomes when most of her classmates went into finance. She took one look at the samples and, after a brief checklist readout, said, "We'll run a rapid whole genome, short reads, deep coverage. Compare to human reference, common primates, known mammalian contaminants. Expect initial mapping in 4 to 6 hours for a preliminary result." I remember the lab lights casting long shadows on the whiteboard that morning as she outlined our plan in blocks of text and arrows. The whiteboard is where our speculative minds get permission to be honest. She drew a simple flow: extract DNA, QC, RNIN concentration, library prep, shotgun, sequencing, alignment, variant calling, phylogenetic inference. She marked a line between alignment and phylogenetic inference and wrote in smaller letters beneath it the phrase we all felt but spoke with caution: implications. We had to be extra cautious because of what would happen if anyone outside this room got hold of the data.
The chain of knowledge needed to be tight. Sarah reminded us, limit the number of hands that know the full picture. If we leak an interpretation now, we risk initiating a cascade we can't control. Clinically, we treat. Ethically, we consider. Strategically, we archive. I scribbled in my notebook, archive as act of stewardship. I have a habit of turning ethical decisions into analogies. It helps me anchor them. Make the archive small, clean, and morally defensible. The alternative, opportunistic publication, instant virality, the spotlight at the expense of lives, was grotesque to imagine. Lisa's team got to work. Library prep took 4 hours. We ran quality checks. The DNA was surprisingly intact for muscle tissue taken under emergency conditions. Library yields were robust. Base quality scores were high. Coverage predicted at 40x. The sequencing run hummed like a slow engine. Alice in the sequencing lab, no, Lisa, had a kettle boiled to the exact pitch of her patients, and we comforted ourselves with coffee and nervous, inconsequential banter. While we waited, we worked through the ethical architecture of the what if. We framed 2 polar options too bluntly: publish and be done for better or worse, or protect and potentially allow the group to persist in the dark. Those options, however, are caricatures. In each scenario, there are nested choices. Do we notify governments? Do we involve conservation NGOs? Do we attempt to find the valley to assess population health? Each choice risked something we had collectively sworn to avoid: exposure. A journal entry the next morning reads, in a lowercase scrawl that suggested fatigue and unease, 0612, ethics meeting in OR conference room. Sarah cautious, Lisa incredulous but compassionate. Marcus wants to ensure welfare first. Jennifer asks if the patient understood language. Kyle quiet. Jennifer had been the first to say quietly, before the debate turned to structure and protocols. He looked at me when I said his name, if that matters. She had been there in the moment the sedative wore thin and the patient's eyes fluttered open. She had been the one to feel his fingers close briefly around hers, a reflexive response that was neither convulsive nor merely involuntary. Jennifer read fingers well. She'd grown up in a home where sign was spoken as fluently as English. That observation would later become pivotal. By mid-morning, Lisa's preliminary alignment pipeline had finished. We gathered around her terminal like a congregation. There is an almost medieval quality to the way scientists organize our rituals around glowing screens. The first output was boring and technical: raw reads, fast Q files, alignment metrics. But then the summary arrived: an initial alignment against the human reference genome, 98.7%. The number sat on the screen as if it could be measured against the air. Lisa's fingers hovered above the keyboard. For a full heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the room inhaled as one.
"Run it again," Marcus said, practical and disbelieving. "Rerun an independent alignment. Cross-check with mitochondrial markers, contamination controls." We ran controls. We sequenced the negative controls. We re-extracted and processed a new library from the remaining sample. We compared microsatellite markers. We cross-checked against chimpanzee and gorilla genomes, other primates, even non-primate mammals, to ensure the alignment was not an artifact of sequence similarity in conserved regions. Each confirmation pulled into place like a bolt tightening. I wrote in the margin of my notebook, hands shaking, initial mapping suggests 98.7% sequence identity to Homo sapiens reference, apparent presence of hominid-specific features, possible chromosome 2 fusion signature, FOXP2 homolog present and expressed. Likely divergence estimate 5200 KY, subject to mutation rate assumptions. Language matters here. A genome is not a moral judgment. It is lists of bases that, when arranged in ways we understand, suggest relationships. Saying 98.7% identity is not the same as saying human. Saying chromosome 2 fusion signature is not the same as saying shared ancestry. But in the room, the air filled with an extra musical note of grief and awe, and the recognition that quiet explanations can't undo the first impression. Whatever this being was, genetically he stood at the edge of our taxonomic categories like a figure in a doorway. We convened immediately. Sarah paced. "We need to assume this will leak unless we act like it won't. Our first obligation is to the patient, medical care. Our second is to the living community that may be exposed if we move too quickly. Our third is to science. Third, not first." She paused, and her voice softened, as if the word third carried moral weight. We will not publish. Not now. Lisa's hands were trembling when she spoke. The numbers are not in error. Coverage is good. We see conserved human exons, non-coding regions consistent with primate regulation. There are unique alleles not present in our reference databases. FOXP2 locus is intact. Variants in regulatory sequences suggest differing expression patterns. We need more data to model divergence time properly, but the simplest parsimonious interpretation is a sister lineage to modern humans. Words like sister lineage made the future heavy. It's one thing to frame an organism in a phylogenetic tree on paper. It's another to realize those branches can hide people. Jennifer asked a question that changed the tenor of the meeting. What if they knew we were listening? What if being found is worse than being left alone? It was not a theoretical question. We had evidence, through pigment smears and healed wounds, that this community had experienced violent contact in the past. They had learned to hide. The implication of our discovery was not only a scientific rearrangement of taxonomy, but the real potential of cultural collapse under human attention. We argued.
We considered options that read like ethics exam answers: controlled, staged, peer-reviewed disclosure with governmental oversight, immediate conservation status requests, an anonymous deposit of genomic data in a secure repository for future study. Each option came with risks and uncertain benefits. We also had to wrestle with our own motives. Publication offers fame, research funding, the chance to rewrite textbooks. Protection demands sacrifice, reputational risk, possible legal complications, and the gnawing knowledge that silence might mean complicity in the disappearance of a culture. Back in the lab, Lisa prepared more in-depth analyses. She wanted to look at the chromosome architecture. Do we see evidence, for instance, of a fused chromosome, analogous to the well-known human chromosome 2 fusion? We discussed FOXP2, a gene associated with speech and complex vocal learning, and SRGAP2, genes implicated in neocortical development. These mentions were not scientific theater. They were the indicators by which you begin to infer capacity for complex sociality: language, tool use, storytelling. I kept thinking of tests you don't want to give because the act of testing itself is invasive. At 1422, we got the next tranche of output: structural variant analysis, copy number variations, and a preliminary phylogenetic tree constructed from a subset of single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, chosen for their low homology. The tree placed our subject as sister to modern humans, separated by an accumulation of variants that, given the assumed mutation rate, suggested a divergence window comfortably nested within the late Pleistocene. The language of the pipeline was cautious, as it should be, estimates consistent with divergence 50-100 KYA, subject to calibration uncertainty and sample bias. I wrote that line out and then underlined it with a pen until the paper tore. By the time the sun had crested and turned the hospital windows into blinding silver mirrors, we had mapped enough of the genome to justify a different kind of meeting, this time with a smaller circle. Sarah, Lisa, Marcus, Jennifer, Kyle, and I sat in a room with the blinds drawn. We knew the terminology we used would determine how people outside would hear the story. "We keep the circle small," Sarah said. She didn't sound like a director then. She sounded like a person who had realized that the correct ethical posture was slow, not swift. We document comprehensively. We allow no external access to the specimen without a unanimous decision. Kyle, who had driven up supplies from the field clinic, rubbed his hands together. "Do we notify public health?" he asked. It was a pragmatic question. Zoonotic disease is not just a scientific curiosity. A new agent in a hidden community is a risk to both parties. We were custodians of two kinds of welfare: biological and cultural. We drafted a list of immediate actions. First, continue medical stabilization and rehabilitative care.
The patient was not a specimen. He breathed, he reacted. Second, create an isolated, ethically reviewed data vault for the genomic information, accessible to no one not on a need-to-know basis. Third, begin non-invasive attempts at communication, recognizing that language would operate on multiple levels: gestural, pictographic, tactile. Jennifer volunteered to be the primary liaison. Anyone who has worked with her quickly learns that she approaches people with a hunger for dignity. She had been raised with sign language as a spoken language in the house. She understood that hands can carry grammar and history in ways that words sometimes cannot. She also understood that trust is not given by a stranger. It is earned one careful touch at a time. That afternoon, we waited for consciousness to come without the cloud of heavy sedatives. He woke in the late afternoon light, eyes opening slowly, focusing with a clarity that belied the inflammation and pain. Jennifer sat beside him, her fingers moving in a relaxed, rhythmic pattern I would later come to recognize as an opening protocol, simple signs for hello, name, friend. She spoke softly, narrating actions as we adjusted dressings and checked vitals.
He watched, then attempted a motion with his hands that was not quite sign and not quite mimicry. It was a series of gestures. He pointed to his chest, tapped twice, drew a shape in the air with his thumb and forefinger as if tracing a map, and then held up 4 fingers. We documented everything. I transcribed that first exchange in my notebook. 1638, patient awake, attempted gestural communication. Gesture set, chest tap, self-indicator, air tracing, map-like representation, 4-finger count. Jennifer attempted reciprocal signs, name sign, safe, people. Patient's response, nod, brief pressure on Jennifer's hand, vocalization, low, rhythmic utterance with apparent prosodic contours. It was the first indication that he understood the idea of self-referential gestures and that he could respond with countable numeracy. 4 fingers could mean many things. 4 wounds, 4 family members, 4 locations. We did not know, but the fact that he attempted to communicate with coherent gestures suggested cognitive mapping of social relationships. That night, when I could sneak a moment alone, I wrote a longer entry in an effort to marshal my thoughts. He is not an animal. He is not merely human either. He sits in a threshold category that makes people greedy and protective in equal parts. I felt both impulses at once and hated myself for it. At 21:05, Jennifer and I began a rudimentary exchange. She drew simple pictographs on a whiteboard, a circle for person, lines for path, a triangle for shelter. He watched, then drew comparable shapes with a charcoal stick on a scrap of blank radiology paper. His lines were deliberate, not childish. A line representing a horizon, a cluster of circles with smaller circles attached. A bar across the top like a roof. He drew again and again, each time refining the shapes. He pointed to the group of circles and then tapped each circle in sequence, ending with an emphatic gesture that might have meant inclusion or emphasis on age, an elder, and then made a small motion that suggested a body lying horizontally, a grave marker perhaps. He then pressed his hand to his chest and signed the gesture for remember, with his fingertips touching his sternum in a way that seemed both ritual and plea. Jennifer interpreted through sign and careful probing questions. Family? She offered slowly. He nodded. How many? He tapped out on his fingers while uttering the same low sounds. She counted to 37 on the whiteboard and watched for his response. He glanced at our faces, then back at the drawing. His hand made a sweeping motion, encompassing the circles in the line of horizon, a motion that suggested a landscape of people. He nodded when we circled 37. That number, 37, wrote itself into my mind like an accusation. 37 human-like persons living in proximity, hidden because history had taught them to hide. 37 lives that could be devastated by curiosity. We slept little. I wrote in a late-night entry, 0321, 37, scope small, danger high. Our usual instinct is to publish, to collect, to classify. Our moral instinct tonight must be custodial. The difference is the difference between telling a story and extinguishing it. We began constructing a non-verbal lexicon, mapping pictographs to basic concepts: water, shelter, child, burial, blood. We matched gestures to basic needs: food, pain, danger. He responded with patience that felt like a refusal to be hurried. When he wanted to indicate something grave, he drew more carefully, and then signed what we later would learn was an invitation and a warning both. Keep quiet, remember. The word remember became a motif. It was not a plea for publicity. It was a charge, like the handing over of a relic. He possessed artifacts, small carved stones, pigments, a tablet of sorts, which he indicated with reverence. He used a sign for book-like objects and the charcoal sketches of symbols that looked like pictographs. He drew a circle enclosing a group, and then a line, and then his hand swept across the shapes as if to say, this is ours, and also we are separate from the world that the sweep implied. At the base of my notebook, I drafted a pragmatic plan for communications research: build a pictographic library, test reference, measure semantic convergence. Jennifer took the lead. She would later tell me that in those first days, communication felt less like translation and more like trust building. You exchange marks and you risk revealing needs and histories. If the other party is harmed for what they tell you, then the act of telling becomes betrayal. We began to see evidentiary patterns beyond the immediate patient.
Pigment smears consistent with ochre were on his hands and under fingernails. Traces of plant fiber suggested basketry. Distinctive wear patterns on teeth suggested a diet with significant abrasive plant material. The skeletal fracture patterns, once scanned and analyzed, suggested repetitive motions consistent with a particular form of locomotion and tool use that diverged from our expectations of either Neanderthal gait or modern human range. Their domestic culture appeared to have complex ritualized aspects, grave markers, a burial arrangement noted in the sketches, and cave-like pictographs he drew with reverence. I found myself returning, again and again, to the ethical hinge. We could not treat these people as a sample collection. They were a living culture. Our science, at its best, offers frameworks to protect and to understand. At its worst, it is justification for extraction. I had to remind myself of a sentence I teach my students. The presence of data does not mandate publication. The presence of a life does not mandate exposure. But when you are a scientist, you become addicted to the clarity publication can bring. There is a vanity to knowledge, an impulse to have your name associated with revelation. I watched that vanity like a small animal skittering at the edges of the meeting room, and I stilled it until the more practical and honest questions could be answered. Late that night, Lisa sent a single-line message to the group chat, an almost innocuous ping that made the room fall silent. Preliminary assembly complete. Bring coffee. We crowded back into the sequencing lab. The machine's printer fed out a single page, and the number sat there in black monospace font, 98.7.
We would attempt to understand and to protect. We would restrict access to the smallest number of people necessary to ensure welfare and to preserve the culture. That decision felt like a vow. Vows change you. I would learn, over the months that followed, the ways a vow can both anchor and gnaw at a person. The patient, who we began to call privately and awkwardly the father, because he represented a social role more than a literal patriarch, remained the hinge between us and the unknown valley. His injuries stabilized. He slept with a blanket drawn tight, fingers occasionally twitching as if dreaming of distant groves. Jennifer brought him small treats, soft fruits, steamed root vegetables that she learned by watching his teeth work. Those small acts built a scaffold of trust. The next morning, Lisa called me aside to show a specific region in the assembly. She pointed to a structural variant map and said quietly, "See this complex rearrangement? Consistent with hominin chromosomal architecture. There are regulatory motifs in neural development zones we would not expect to be so conserved if there hadn't been a shared evolutionary pathway." She was precise, as she always is, and her precision was not cold. The words evolutionary pathway are a way of talking about kinship at the genetic level. The implication for me was existential. The line that separates human from other becomes less an absolute boundary and more an epistemological fog. When the fog lifts, people crown themselves the discoverers. People who love and depend on secrecy get harmed. I asked Lisa a blunt question. If we had to present this to a review board tomorrow, what would we say? She did not blink. We say we have an injured patient with genome structure consistent with being a sister lineage to Homo sapiens. We say further research is required. We say our priority is welfare and confidentiality. We do not say Bigfoot. We avoid social media language. We control the narrative by controlling access. It was a pragmatic answer, and yet in its pragmatism I felt a moral gravity. How do you keep a secret in the age of emergency alerts and smartphones? How do you withhold a truth from the world when the world insists that truth belongs to everyone? I wrote in the margin of my notebook, the difference between secret and sacred is permission. By the time we were exhausted and the patient had taken to humming low, rhythmic sounds in sleep, we had assembled enough of a phased plan to buy time. We would continue clinical care while constructing a small, encrypted archive of genomic and anthropological data, photographs, sketches, whiteboard logs, and transcripts of gestures. We would formalize our commitment with documented ethical statements filed in sealed envelopes to be opened only under specific conditions.
We would begin discreet outreach to a select council of anthropologists and ethicists we trusted, people with reputations for discretion, people who had navigated the fraught border between science and stewardship. I closed that day's notes with the line, "We are custodians now. Custodianship asks for restraint, and restraint asks for faith in a future that may never grace our names." It is impossible, even now, to reconstruct the precise sequence of small, delicate decisions that led us from the lab to the valley. There are administrative forms and approvals and slow nights of deliberation, but the kernel of it was simpler: trust and the patient's own gestures. He had sketched pictographs of a place and touched them as if imploring us to learn and to remember. He entrusted us with objects, small tablets, carved stones, given into our care like offerings. Those gestures carried a moral weight that competed with the instinct to disclose. The decision to remain silent was not unanimous at first. There were heated arguments, private doubts, and the human temptation to imagine the fame that publication could bring. But each argument returned to the same fulcrum. Would exposure improve or destroy the lives at stake? The answer, with the humility we tried to hold, leaned toward protection. The next phase would require more than lab work. It would require field work, controlled contact, and cultural humility. I found in the thin hours between sleep and duty that the word humility kept surfacing like a prayer. We had to approach with deference, not dominion. We had to remember that the story we were about to witness was not ours to own. The last entry in my notebook for that segment reads, 2358, vowed to protect memory. Tablet gifted. He placed his hand on the tablet and then on my chest. He signs, remember. I sign back, witness. It felt like an initiation. My hands were sticky with coffee and compassion. We closed the small circle around the truth as best we could. We made the technological decision to mirror the data to an air-gapped server and to burn the keys into physical form held in locked files. We wrote contingency plans. We rehearsed what we would say if questioned by authorities. We rehearsed silence. And then, as the last practical step before deeper investigations, we reran the sequencing once more, with an alternate platform, another independent library prep, and a different computational pipeline. Science wants reproducibility, but the human heart wants reassurance. In the early hours, the second printer feed ejected another readout. We watched it fall like a verdict onto the console tray. 98.7%. My hands, for reasons I could not wholly explain, began to tremble anew. The number was the same. For now, the genome was consistent and insistent.
It doubled the seriousness of what lay before us. We had found not a myth or a misclassification, but a living set of people whose genetics, culture, and history intersected painfully with human expansion. The knowledge, once verified, didn't feel like a triumph. It felt like the beginning of a responsibility I had not fully understood when I first put my name on the application for evolutionary biology. We sat in that dark lab and let the seriousness of our decisions settle over us like a cloak. The machine hummed. The patient slept, hands folded like a prayer. I put the pen down, and with a small, private ritual, I wrote the title of the archive on the inside page of my notebook in ink that I sealed with a smear as if to commit it. This scientist learned the truth about Bigfoot. It was never meant to be known. The sentence in my hand carried both defiance and apology. It admitted what we had found and what we had chosen not to do with it. It was a line I would come back to in darker hours. It was a promise I had made at a table under fluorescent lights, while a man with hands like dinner plates rested in a cot just down the hall. We had confirmed something incredible, and with the confirmation, the world shifted its weight. We had to decide what to do next. We had maps of genetics and fragments of gesture-based communication, and we had a charge to remember. The next steps would require traveling out of the hospital and into the field, into a landscape that could not be published as data points on a map. We needed to understand their lives on their terms, to witness without owning, to document without destroying. We were, in short, going to the valley. I closed that night's file, and before sleep took me for a few hours, I wrote one more note. Prepare for field. Secure permissions. Limit team. Take only what is necessary. Protect the tablet. Keep the circle small. The valley waited, and with it the danger and the promise that comes when human curiosity meets human dignity. We moved out of the hospital like people carrying contraband, with small crates of medical supplies instead of cash, sealed evidence bags instead of suitcases, and a sense of urgency that felt more like grief than adventure. The plan was intentionally mundane. 3 vehicles, a field medic kit, the smallest possible team capable of addressing both clinical and anthropological needs. We left the patient in a secure wing under Marcus's care with orders to maintain sedation only as needed for wound management, and we took with us the tablet, wrapped in sterile gauze and a layer of my scarf, placed into a pelican case whose foam I had cut to fit it like a reliquary. We drove until the pavement softened and then ended at the place where a map becomes suggestion. From there we hiked, carrying water bladders and the kinds of instruments anthropologists bring when they mean to be unseen. Notebooks, charcoal, soft brushes, a camera with no GPS stamp, and a field microscope.
Sarah had insisted on one extra measure, a legal pad with sealed envelopes containing explicit statements of our ethical commitments to be placed in a bank safe in case something went horribly wrong. She used phrases like precautionary containment and non-disclosure, language that felt both bureaucratic and prayerful. The terrain was a patient kind of green, Old growth has a cadence of its own, trunks spaced like the ribs of an immense animal, moss thread-like and luminous, light breaking through in blade-shaped shafts that hang motionless in the understory. The air smelled of resin and wet stone. At times the gradient underfoot required careful footwork. At others, it opened into a bowl of ferns. We moved quietly, as if the forest required it. Our first camp was a minimal affair. We pitched without fire the first night, both for safety and to reduce smoke signatures. From a distance that was still humanly visible, it would have seemed like nothing more than a brief occupation. A few tarps, low-profile tents, the hum of medical refrigeration in the back of the truck. We ate cold rations and talked in whispers that eventually dissolved into a heavy silence. I recorded the following entry that night, the handwriting slipping a little where my fingers had not yet learned the new steadiness the valley demanded. 22:11. Camp established. Team: Sarah, Lisa, Marcus, Jennifer, Kyle, myself. Supplies staged for 3 days. Tablet wrapped and with me. No attempt to triangulate local villages or trails. Purpose: observation, cultural exchange on their terms, health assessment. Keep circle small. We gave ourselves 3 days of reconnaissance and listening. I am not a field ethnographer by trade. My training is in comparative genomics and evolutionary inference. But the months in the lab had taught me 2 things about this work. Data without context is dangerous, and context without humility is theft. We intended to listen first, to be present second, and to act only with the consent of those who had the power to grant it. Our movement into the interior was slow. The father's charcoal drawing served as our map, more like a schematic of relationships and landscape features than a set of coordinates. We found trails that matched his horizon lines, a river that cut through basalt, a stand of trees with white bark, a rocky overhang that the charcoal sketches shaded heavily, likely a cave of significance. Sometimes his gestures by way of Jennifer supplemented the maps, a hand tracing elevation, a tapping motion to indicate water. We translated gesture to terrain with the clumsy reverence of people trying to learn a new grammar of the world. On the morning we first sighted a clearing of dwellings, the forest gave us a sound we had not expected. Human voices, not shouts or alarms, but layered murmurings, words, laughter, the clatter of small tools. For a moment I felt stone cold with a foreign kind of fear. Fear that the moment we were permitted in would also be the moment we took something irreversible. We left the vehicles and approached slowly, Jennifer at my side, doing what she had done in the hospital, hands moving, signing simple concepts, hums and small rhythms that seemed to create an ambient calm. She signaled to the group that we would not approach directly. Instead, we sat on a root and waited. To our right, a small child, hair long and braided, body compact and quick, emerged to the edge of the trees. She carried a ceramic bowl and looked at us with eyes that were young and unafraid in a way that made me feel more exposed than any genomic disclosure had. It was Jennifer who bridged first. She lifted her palms, open, flat, and made the sign we had established for friend. The child cocked her head, considered, and then returned to the sign with a small smile. The gesture loosened something in the clearing. Within minutes an older woman appeared, her hands stained faintly with pigment, and an elder with hair like braided driftwood stepped forward. The father followed, leaning on a staff carved with notches. The reunion was quiet and precise. There was ceremony in how the father moved between us and his people, an allowance and accounting. He held out his weathered palm to the elder, who touched it, then pressed a small carved bead into his hand and placed a circle of pigment on his forehead. The act read both like benediction and like accounting. You come bearing responsibility. We were taken, as carefully as a breath held to give space to sacredness, into their world. It was domestic, layered with tools and textures I had not expected. Woven hammocks, a hearth whose embers had the slow, living smell of resin, baskets whose weave spoke of practiced hands, and small graves arranged with small stones and tokens. The dwellings were neither primitive nor preserved. Rather, they were equipment of life, adaptive and considered. At the heart of their space was a painted wall, not graffiti nor amateur scrawl, but a work that occupied the function of both archive and altar. Ochres and blacks layered with figures in motion, people carrying children, boats or representations of boats, animals drawn with a kind of affectionate precision,
Hands indicated in line work that resembled the very gestures by which we had met them. The pictographs were not primitive. They were a language folded into pigment. The colors had been chosen with skill. I ran my gloved hand at the edge and felt the pigment's dry, almost powdery texture. We spent 2 days in the clearing under observation. The team's role was defined and small. Treat wounds as they were revealed, learn a lexicon of gestures, record but not photograph anything that might betray location.
We sat in shared silence. We learned that the father's name, when he gave one, and he gave one slowly, with 2 fingers tapping at his breast to indicate identity, translated loosely to a word that our imperfect mapping rendered as keeper. That was both specific and archetypal. In their social arrangement, his role was caretaker of memory, a cultural position anchored in long practices of burial and story-making. I had steel panels of training in me, consent practices, deferred reciprocity, the need for minimal interference, yet nothing in training prepares you for the intimacy of being handed a small carved stone and feeling the weight of history press against your palm. The father took me by the elbow once, pulled me away from the group to a place where 3 boulders made a private rectangle, and signed slowly, "Remember." He opened the pelican case and pointed at the tablet, then at my chest, then at his people. The meaning was not subtle. The transfer of the tablet was not theatrical. There was no parade. He lifted it with both hands and placed it in my lap. The gesture felt like an investiture, a simple, non-performative passing of trust. He then made a sequence of gestures, hand over heart, palm open to the sky, fingers touching the ground, that over time, and with Jennifer's help, we came to understand as a compact of stewardship. Hold memory, speak only to those pledged, protect the object's integrity, and if anything threatens the community, prioritize their flight rather than their defense. That evening there was a small ceremony. I was given a place by the fire, not in the center, but close enough for the voices and stories to warm my face. They told, in gestures and fragmented vocalizations we interpreted through Jennifer's patient questions, a narrative that folded migration, encounter, and retreat into a single arc. It was not a simple origin myth. It was a history told in the language of survival. First, movement across a wide landscape. Then, contact with other humans that brought violence and disease. Then, concealment and the slow pruning of numbers through accidents and encounters that favored secrecy. They had names for places that were not ours to map. They had rituals for graves, stones upright, pigment smears on the brow, knots left in baskets to tie the story to the object. In their ritual, the tablet was not merely an object. It was a ledger of losses and of kin. At one point, an elder reached toward me and traced the shape of my face with a calloused finger, then tapped his temple and then his chest. He looked straight at me and made the sign for remember again. There was no arrogance in the demand. There was only the quiet gravity of a people who had learned that the world does not always accord privacy or mercy to those who do not fit categories. The father, Kate, Jennifer named her in a whispered aside for us to humanize in our notebooks, and the elders stayed with us into the night, speaking in heavy, rhythmic tones, and sometimes simply beginning to make marks on a scrap of bark. We watched as they made a map of the valley on a flat piece of stone, ridges indicated by ridged incisions, water by pitted dots, trees by clusters of hash marks. The map was functional. It allowed them to teach new members where to forage and where to shelter. It is also, I realized later, a way of making the land speak human speech. Throughout our stay, there were constant reminders of fragility built into daily life. Children were taught the names of edible plants by story. This leaf you eat, this root you boil, this berry you avoid because it makes your mouth numb. Tools were mended with tender attention. Old wounds were tended by salves and compresses that reflected a deep practical knowledge of herbs and a practical pharmacy bound by necessity. One of the children carried a wooden flute carved with notches. When she played it, it sounded neither modern nor ancient, but simply familiar, a melody that filled the clearing, and made me realize how similar the patterns of lullaby are across any boundary. Science returned to us in small moments. We took non-invasive samples, hair, saliva swabs, a scrap of soil from around a burial site, only with explicit permission. I recorded dental wear patterns and gait observations. Lisa made notes about cranial morphology and documented cultural artifacts with careful sketches rather than photographs. We never took a bone. We do not become the story they tell, Sarah reminded us quietly the day before we left. We are recipients, not owners. On our third day, I was led into a cave by the father, Jennifer walking slightly behind me to anchor translation. The cave was cool and smelled faintly of mineral and the kind of sweet dampness that has no name in the lab. On the cave wall were pigments, panels of ochre and black, figures rendered in a style that was both representational and schematic. A line of handprints arced across the wall, imprints pressed with pigment, fingers splayed as if to mark claim or to mark attendance. At one point, the father tapped the wall gently and then touched my chest. He pressed his hand to the stone where a handprint had once been, and then covered his face with both hands. I sat there, knees cold, and watched his shoulders shake. He did not cry aloud. The quiver was private and terrible in a way that made me feel I had intruded on a grief too old to be ours. Yet he had chosen to let us in. Later, in the safety of our tent, we made rough transcripts of the symbols. I made careful descriptions in my notebook more than literal transcriptions. An arrangement of circles, a set of vertical bars, a looping mark that recurred as a signifier of kin. I knew enough of semiotics to recognize that we were dealing with a system that could encode complex events.
Lisa argued that if we could align the pictographic sequences with their rituals and oral reports, we might begin to approach a translation key. That possibility excited and terrified me in equal measure. I wrote a field log entry that night. 0304, cave mural examined. Pictographs show sequences consistent with kinship events, birth, death, migration. Handprints arc across eastern wall. Pigment composition appears to be iron oxide charcoal mix. The tablet, shorter than my palm, incised with linear and geometric motifs, may function as mnemonic device, not literal script. Consent obtained for limited sampling. Micro-pigment scrape from edge. No photography of precise cave location. That last line, no photography of precise cave location, was not paranoia. It was prudence. The smallest Instagram post could become a tinderbox. On the final morning of our stay, the community gathered. The ritual we observed was austere. They placed small tokens at the bases of their graves, sang a thin, lilted rhythm, and then wrapped each item in woven grass and tucked them into an earthen hollow. The father, in the role we had come to know his name by, stood before me and recited, in a sequence of signs I do not claim to translate perfectly, a pledge that was both instruction and benediction. He placed his hand on the tablet, and then on my chest. He moved his fingers over the tablet's surface in a way that suggested not reading, but blessing. With Jennifer's translation, we learned the phrasing, keep what we give, do not break what we hide. If the world threatens, let us flee, and you keep our memory. I felt a weight in my chest that night that was not only responsibility, but a kind of grief. Grief for the inevitability of exposure that hangs on discovery, and sorrow for the smallness of what protection can do in the face of large appetites. I have watched in my career how the world tends to gather a chorus of interest around the rare and the spectacular. Press, funding agencies, governmental intrigue. Each actor brings its own logic and, frequently, its own appetite. The ethics of withholding information for protection is always contested in the world of public science. The temptation to be first is a human reflex I have seen stalk many labs. We pledged to resist it. We left with the tablet and with artifacts that had been explicitly gifted. Small beads, a carved comb, a length of woven cord. The father had given them reluctantly, with hands that trembled in ways that were not all physical. Sometimes a culture ensures survival by dispersion of its symbols. Sometimes it compels strict retention. He chose dispersion. The journey back to the lab constrained us into roles we had not sought but could not abdicate. Once home, the work began again, this time with even more devotion to security. The tablet was cataloged into a locked safe in an air-gapped room.
Lisa began comparative analyses of the pigment, a mix of iron oxide and plant charcoal, with binders that suggested long practice. Marcus oversaw the medical follow-up with the patient, who by then had regained more function. We established a rotating watch on the encrypted drives. We also set about creating the archive we had promised. We wrote sealed ethical statements and copied them into 2 secure locations. We drafted a memorandum of non-disclosure to be signed by any external reviewer we might later consult. We constructed a narrative account for internal use only, pages that stitched photographs devoid of location markers, with careful notes on gestures, material culture, and tentative interpretations. The goal was a record that could be used for future protection, but which, in the present, would not be a vector for harm. Despite our carefulness, threats arrived like small, quiet things first. A drone sighting reported in a nearby national park, a rumor in a hunting community, a vague forum post from someone who claimed to have seen strange tracks. These noises coalesced into a pattern of unease. We increased security, but also returned to the question at the center of everything. Do we stay and perhaps become the inadvertent source of harm, or do we withdraw and risk the artifacts being lost to time?
It was in this knot of unease that the first breach of our assumptions occurred. One morning, Kyle came into the lab, pale and wordless, his palms smudged with grease. He had been on an errand when he saw a logging truck parked near a trail we had earlier designated as a no-go. There was nothing we could prove, and nothing that indicated intent toward the valley specifically, but the presence of outsiders so close carried the freight of risk. One curious hiker, one misinformed forest contractor, one lost cell phone camera, all could unravel what we had carefully held together. That night we convened a meeting that was rawer than our earlier debates. Sarah looked at each of us and said simply, "We make plans for flight, because flight is often the only decent option for small cultures." Lisa argued for a cautious, staged notification to a trusted conservation group that had a reputation for clandestine protection. Marcus argued for beefed-up medical contingency if we were forced to evacuate members. Jennifer argued that any escalation would require the consent of the community. We were not sovereign in the name of their safety. Our decision was layered. We would not unilaterally involve outsiders beyond the small ring we had assembled, but we would prepare for evacuation assistance that could be deployed at a moment's notice with the consent of the Valley people. We cataloged caches of supplies to be left where they could be retrieved by the Valley if they fled. Dry goods, medical caches, trade beads. We rehearsed silent signals. We practiced ways to mask human scent and signs to reduce chances of discovery.
I documented the meeting in the lab log with the heavy hand of someone who felt the moral weight of every adjective. 14:30, security meeting, threat vector, increased outsider activity observed near peripheral trail. Decision, prepare evacuation support, no external disclosures. Record contingency supplies and cache coordinates in encrypted ledger, accessible to signatories only. We kept to our plan. For 3 weeks, life in the lab and life in the valley ran a brittle, fragile parallel. The father healed slowly, and with more resilience than the prognosis suggested. He resumed leadership, walking with less of a limp and more of an economy that comes with years of practical adaptation. He taught us, by sign and by demonstration, aspects of their domestic life that changed how I thought about human adaptation. A style of stonework that supported rain channels, a way of knotting baskets so they could be hung and warded against small mammals, a practice of burying seeds alongside grave goods, a deliberate act of regeneration. And then, in a sweep that I still find hard to recount without shaking, the valley had disappeared. We returned on a quiet morning after receiving word from a local ranger, unwilling, necessary intermediary, that there had been a disturbance. We approached with caution, telling ourselves small consolations. Perhaps they had relocated a short distance away. Perhaps they were hiding. Perhaps they had retreated temporarily. None of those consolations prepared me for the sight that greeted us when the clearing opened up. Fires still warm and coals dying, bowls left mid-use, hammocks swung empty, and only the smallest traces of hurried departure. There was evidence of departure, not of a violent assault. No charred dwellings, no sign of a large-scale incursion. Instead, things were strewn in how you might imagine hurriedness. A tool dropped, a child's shawl tangled in a fence, a burial marker knocked askew. The cave still had its mural, but the handprints had been partially erased as if by dampness, or perhaps intentionally blurred. In one dug grave, we found evidence of recent soil disturbance. There was no tablet. The place felt like a house whose occupants had left in a hurry to the unknown. We called off the search that afternoon. We scoured impressions and tracks and found nothing that could be reliably traced to large organized groups. There were, however, patterns that suggested human curiosity had been present. Recent boot prints in the soft soil near a peripheral slope, a series of flattened grasses leading toward a low road. Nothing definitive, and yet enough to suggest that the privacy they needed had been compromised. I remember standing in the middle of the clearing and feeling a kind of emptiness that is not the same as solitude. Solitude is chosen. Emptiness is a problem imposed. I felt the loss of their presence as if they had been my family and had moved away without leaving a forwarding address.
The father was not there. The tablet was not there. The only thing that remained in my hand, ironically the most portable proof of our stewardship, was the small bead on a cord that the elder had slipped into my palm the last night. It had been meant, perhaps, as a guarantee that memory would remain. We returned to the lab with the scent of smoke still in our clothes and the list of missing items in our notebooks. The aftermath was a long, dry ache. We increased our security again and made decisions that would haunt me for the rest of my career. We would not attempt a public appeal. We would not publish. We would keep the tablet and the bead and the memories.
We would focus on documentation and on creating a record that could be used to rebuild should they ever choose to return. The option of going public sat like a hot coal against the inside of my palm. If we exposed them now, we might invite protection, but we would almost certainly invite the kind of curiosity that destroys. Months passed. We continued to monitor, quietly, through the network of rangers and through careful, non-invasive patrols we authorized. Occasionally a report would come, a sighting from a distant ridge, a mention of a structure seen in a valley, a story told by a hunter of a shadow seen at dusk. Each report was like holding water in cupped hands. It evaporated and left me with a wet impression of what might have been. Over time, the moral geometry of our decisions stretched and frayed. We had kept a secret, and secrets have effects that ripple beyond their intent. People who are excluded are not always spared. Omitted details become rumors. Protecting privacy became, in some circles, a kind of sin of omission, a withholding from the public good. Yet I remained convinced, with a stubbornness that sometimes felt unscientific, that our duty to the living outweighed the public's claim to knowledge. In the quiet, I wrote more into the archive. I wrote methodically, the lab logs, sequence runs with checksums and hashed identifiers, the field logs, micropigment assays, notes on basket weave patterns, Jennifer's sign lexicon, illustrations of gestures with glosses, Lisa's genomic notes, carefully phrased sentences about chromosomal architecture, and FOPX2 homologs that insisted on uncertainty with every clause. Those documents were not articles, they were a ledger of stewardship. A sample from the genomic appendix, phrased as Lisa insisted upon it, read like this in my notes. Preliminary assembly consistent with high identity to Homo sapiens reference, average nucleotide identity circa 98.7%. Evidence of structural rearrangement consistent with hominin-like chromosomal fusion at region analogous to human chromosome 2. FOPX2 homolog present with regulatory variants possibly affecting expression patterns. sRGAPX2 duplicated copies of uncertain functional consequence. Divergence estimate from human lineage, 50-100 KYA, subject to calibration and sample bias.
Lisa's phrasing always reminded me of the ethical tightrope, to be precise without being presumptuous. She had an unshakable faith in not overstating, and that restraint steadied the archive's tone. Someone asked once whether we had considered releasing anonymized genetic data to conservation groups. The question was pragmatic. Anonymized data could prompt protective measures without indicating location. I thought of data as language that, if misread by the wrong actors, could cause harm. We considered masked release under strict legal terms, but the potential for re-identification through cross-referencing databases made the risk unacceptable. We continued to say no. Years later, the Valley's absence became part of my private litany. I kept the bead and the tablet in a safe deposit box after the lab experience began to attract funding requests from organizations who would not be satisfied with our circumscribed approach. The tablet lived in cruciform temperature control. I would take it out sometimes in the small hours and trace the incisions with a gloved fingertip. It was not a text in the way our world thinks of a printed page. It was an object that encoded relationships, lists of names, symbols for kin, notations for seasons, warnings, and invocations. Some panels seemed to act as enumerations, others held imagery so precise it read like portraiture of events. On certain nights I would read aloud from my own notebook, transcripts of gestures, approximations of the tablet's incisions, and quotes from the Father in my worst translations. Reading those lines felt at once like profanation and like prayer. I had promised to remember, and remembering is an act that can be performed silently. I kept the record from view, but not from mind. There were days when the strain of secrecy became a private fracture. Friends in the field asked why my publications had slowed. Colleagues speculated on burnout. I wrote that sometimes language is inadequate. To say nothing publicly is not to say nothing at all. It is a choice that takes work. Secrecy demands constant reinforcement. It is a living thing, sustained by commitments and rituals, not unlike the ones the Fathers Group used to care for their dead. My final major entry in the archive, written some years after our fieldwork, reads like this. 0715, archival decision reaffirmed. Tablet retained under air-gapped custody. Artifact hashes logged. No identifying metadata to be shared beyond signatory circle.
In the event of forced disclosure, protocol, immediate dispersal of digital keys to distributed trusted repositories and public release of low-resolution cultural notes without site locators. Purpose: preserve cultural autonomy, minimize risk of external harm. Between the lines of that prosaic sentence lie nights of insomnia and long arguments with my own conscience.
I think about the couple we met, the younger pair who danced by the fire and who braided each other's hair, who will never appear in a textbook. I think about the child with the flute, whose melody lives now only in my memory, and the small bead on my neck. The knowledge that I held in secret felt like a wound I could not show anyone without doing harm. I learned to live with the wound as a form of devotion. Occasionally I get letters, anonymous snippets that suggest someone in a government office has read our leaked summary, or that an internet rumor is congealing into a modern myth. I do not reply. I do not correct. Silence is sometimes the most honorable response. When the pressure becomes near unbearable, I consult my own record. I reread the father's gestures transcribed into English. I rewatch the fragments of video we kept secure for internal research. The fidelity of the memory keeps me tethered. I am not alone in the circle. The others carry their obligations with me. There is a final image that keeps returning to me, a line of pigment in a cave, and the way a handprint lingers even when people have left. I think about what it means to be a witness. There are tests of witness that are not scientific. Will you tell only the story that keeps people safe? Will you alter truth to protect? Or will you allow the world to know everything at the cost of the small lives that cannot withstand being specimens? I made a promise the night the tablet was given to me, a promise to remember and to protect. It has been the axis of my life since. It has cost me professional recognition and replaced it with something harder to measure, the knowledge that in a world that demands spectacle, some dignity must be withheld. There is no neat ending to this account. The valley stands as an absence and a presence at once. I have placed portions of the archive under different guardianship, trusted anthropologists who have sworn explicitly to our non-disclosure terms, an ethicist who has lodged legal opinions to be exercised only under narrow conditions, a physical deposit in a bank safe in which the tablet rests under climate control. The details of those measures are not for public record, for secrecy itself is a mode of protection. Before I close my notebook for good, I translate as best I can a fragment of the tablet that seems neither claim nor plea, but rather an instruction on memory. The image is of a circle of hands, some open, some closed, some holding beads, some holding knots. Underneath are incisions that, in our gloss, read, "Gather the names, keep the cords. If we must leave the land, take the list. Sing the names by the bone, hold water for the young." I could have made that line into a paper that would have assured me tenure. I could have written a headline that would have attracted every interested institution. I refused. I chose instead to transcribe, to translate, and to bury those translations in a file that I have labeled only for myself.
It is the most public secret I have kept. I write this account not as documentary proof, but as witness. The world will demand evidence beyond narrative. I cannot provide that and keep my vow. What I can provide is testimony, a ledger of what I saw, what I learned, and what I chose to protect. If you read this with a mind open to stewardship rather than spectacle, I ask you to consider one small ethical posture. Some truths, once exposed, cannot be healed. Sometimes the proper act is not the one that wins acclaim, but the one that allows others to survive. Remembering is not the same thing as proclaiming. Memory can be an act of survival. I keep the tablet because it was given in trust. I keep the bead because it was a token of covenant. I keep the list of gestures because they are the only language we have to speak of them without locating them. And in my work, I attempt to hold both science and humility together, even when that requires resisting professional incentives designed to reward exposure. There is a cost to secrecy. There is also a cost to exposure. I have chosen the lesser harm as I can see it, paying nightly with the knowledge that some will call me coward and others will call me custodian. Both names sit on my desk. If this story has touched you, consider what it asks of us all: to honor the unseen, to protect the vulnerable, and to weigh curiosity against consequence. Support, if you can, organizations and researchers who practice ethical restraint
and who prioritize the communities they study over the prospect of publication. If you value careful, long-form investigation held to an ethic of protection, subscribe to this archive to receive other stories that attempt to balance knowledge and dignity. We have kept a vow. We intend to keep it. I keep the tablet under my hand now, and sometimes, in the quiet late hours, I trace its worn surface and hear the memory of that child's flute. The valley is gone from view, but not from responsibility. I will continue to bear witness. This scientist learned the truth about Bigfoot. What I learned was not how to prove a myth, but how fragile is the life that lurks on the edges of our maps. Some truths, it seems, were never meant to be known widely. They were meant to be remembered.